Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you've been doing. For the free tutorial today, I'd like to share with you my Faux Filigree Pendant. Now you can make these as large and dramatic or small and diminutive as you like. It just takes a singular bead, a couple of gauges of wire and some practice at swirling. So let's head down to the board and take a closer look. I'm dubbing this the Fauxligree Pendant. See what I did there? Classical filigree is made with scrolled wire that is typically soldered into position. There's no soldering with this, it's a little bit of wrapping wire. So let's take a closer look and then we'll make one together. So this is the Faux Filigree Pendant or the Fauxligree Pendant. It just uses a singular bead and a couple of different techniques of wire bending or manipulation. I'm going to be using 3 different gauges of wire today, but you can play around with that as you start to get used to the different techniques that we'll be using. So let's pop that down on the board for a second. And then we'll bring in our first piece of wire. So to begin with, I have a 1.25mm gauge, which is approximately 16 gauge piece of wire. And this is in the region of 5 inches in length. What we're going to do to start off with is put a little spiral beginning down at the bottom. And I'll start with a closed up loop before switching to my bent chain nose pliers to create a slightly more open loop. Now the reason I'm making a more open loop is so that we can connect the different sections of this piece together later on. So I'm just going to bring that around a couple of times. You can make it much larger or much smaller, really to your heart's content, dependent on how big you want the whole design to sit. So let's take that round a little bit further. I think probably 2.5 times. And the important thing is that you do leave a gap, that this spiral is open. It doesn't have to be as open as this if you want a smaller piece. And indeed, you can have fewer rotations of the wire coming around. So once I've got enough for the size that I'm looking for, I'm going to pull that wire very firmly away at a right angle so that it sits up in the same way that I make my little double spiral head pins. We're going to ensure that if we put that down on the board and that continuous line goes through, it goes through the dead centre of those spirals. So do just take a second to make sure that you're happy with the angle that you have there and that you have a nice straight section of wire just coming away. Now in terms of the bead that I'm using, today I'm going to be using a 10mm faceted agate. This is a really beautiful piece, but as long as it goes onto your 1.25 or 16 gauge wire, you can use pretty much whatever bead you fancy. Now just to stop this from coming undone at the top, I'm not going to create the wrapped loop just yet. What I want to do is to put a little bit of warmth up at the top and just turn the end over so that whilst I'm working, nothing goes wrong and my bead doesn't fall off. You don't even have to add the bead on right now if you don't want to. So that's the first piece of our design done. The second section is to make some spiraling. Now this is a technique that I came up with using a 2-step bail maker. These are really useful to have, and I will just measure those pins to see what sizes we have. But you can play around with that. So I've got 4 on one side and 6 on the other side. Really useful for making even spaces. Also really useful for making nice little diminutive bails up at the top of your designs. So to create this, we're going to be working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I would very strongly recommend working from the reel. However, that can get a little bit unwieldy, so I've just got a scrap length and I'm going to show you the basic technique. As I mentioned, this is a scrap length, so I'm just going to trim that end away, making sure that we start with a nice flush section of wire on the end. So to begin creating this design, and I have a video dedicated entirely to creating bezels, and this is one of the bezels that you can use. You can use this really lovely as a bezel or as just a surround for designs to add dimension to pendants, just to make them that little bit larger. So let's get going. I'm going to start with the smaller of those 2 pins, and I'm going to create a rounded form where the wire meets back towards itself. So if I just flip that over sideways, you can see that the cut end of the wire meets the remainder of the wire. So once you have created that form, what we're going to do is to put that pin back in, but switch the direction of that wire onto the larger of those two pins. So if I drop that back like so, you can see it makes this, it's almost like a swan shape. So we've created a circle using the smaller pin, the 4mm pin, and then a circle using the larger pin, the 6mm pin. What I'm going to do now is to put the smaller pin inside the bottom, the lowest section of that swan shape. So if I just allow that pin to sit inside and then draw that wire across like so, and then pull that all the way around bit by bit so it doubles up down at the bottom. Now that swan has got a circular form, looks a little bit like a wing. Let me just turn that light down. That's a little bit better. I will repeat this design a couple of times for you. So a 4mm loop, switch direction to create about 3/4 of a 6mm circular form, but then switch to creating a 4mm form instead, and that wire sits on top of itself. Then what we're going to do is to pop the smaller pin back through that hole again and draw the tail back in the opposite direction around the larger pin. So if I pull that back out again, you'll be able to see that if you imagine the top bit's taken off, you've got another one of those little swan shapes. So a 6mm down at the base here, and we've created around about 3/4 of that shape. Before we add in the smaller pin, I'm going to draw that across the back again and all the way around. So you can see that underneath you're doubling up on that wire. Let's remove those pins again. So you're going to build up. You start off with a small circle all by itself. Then you create 3/4 of a big circle, but turn it into a small circle. Switch in the opposite direction, create 3/4 of a big circle, but turn it into a small circle. So now we need to put the smaller pin back in that smaller hole. Just slide that up into position and then draw the wire back in the opposite direction. So you create another little swan shape. And you've probably already worked out that the next thing we're going to do is to put the smaller pin in and turn that into a smaller circle. So you're constantly rotating, and after a while you'll get used to not having to remove the pin every single time until you've created the next little bit going. And then you can add in your next small spiral, flip that all the way around, over the top. You can even wiggle that to bring the wire back in the opposite direction. So just keep going until you've got a nice long length of this wiggly wire, which becomes our faux filigree. Now, as I mentioned, a genuine filigree is made of little spirals, little coils of wire. Sometimes it's a flat ribbon, sometimes it's a round wire, sometimes it's a different profile, and they tend to be laid down and then they are soldered together. You can sometimes make a filigree by piercing. I'm not very good with a saw, so I tend to not do that. Just keep going until you get a nice long stretch of this useful squiggly material, and then you can take some time just to warm it through and make sure that it's nice and straight and even. You will get some deviations, so take your time. Just spend a few minutes just making sure that that's nice and straight and nice and warm as well. So just keep going until you get a nice length that you think is large enough to create your faux filigree pendant. It's always really useful to have lengths of this anyway, so if you get bored one night and maybe your mojo's left you, you don't know what to make jewellery wise, you could just make some strips like this. You can use them as instant bezels or extra decoration, or simply add them to a very heavy wire to make a really beautiful collar or collarette design. They're really handy also for hanging charms from if you tie them onto that heavy wire or even onto a pre-made collar. It's a really beautiful design to get down to. Now, I do have a dedicated video which I'll put up in just a little card here right now, and that tells you how to make different bezels that you can use. It focuses partly on this design as well. Let's head back down to the board and we'll take a look at the next stage. So for the next stage of our tutorial, we're going to be adding in a further 5-inch length of wire. Now I've gone for 1mm or 18 gauge this time because I'm conscious to keep the weight down. I've used the heavy wire in the centre because that spiral does form quite a structural part of the design. You could again go for 1.25mm or 16 gauge, but I'm just going to be using 18 gauge here. So that's going to add around the outside of our faux filigree pendant. The next thing we're going to do is to start attaching our lovely squiggly bit to that 5-inch length of wire, and you can see I've got a bit of a gap on either end, and that's generally because I don't quite know how large I want this to be really at this stage. So the two ways to do this: you can create a strip where you add your loopy section to this section of wire and then form it round, but I much prefer to be a little bit more organic with it. Start in the centre of my strip of squiggles, and because we've warmed this nicely all the way through the process, you'll find it's relatively easy to make a nice sort of smile shape without deforming those wires too much. And what we're looking to do is to have that scooting around the bottom of the design, so that you connect the base of that spiral where we began the design to the base of those swirly bits. Now it doesn't have to be tied on all the way around, just down at the bottom. That's why we have this safety wire on the outside. So what we're going to do is to see how tight we want that to go around the base, how close we want it to come to the bead, and just make sure that we're keeping everything nice and even. Sometimes the wires get a little bit out of control, but because you warm your wire when you work it, it's very easy to bring that back together. So if I just hold these two pieces together, sort of superimposing one bit over the top of the other, I can see that I've got more than I need of that wire up at the top. So I think I'm going to trim at around about this area. So if I find the underside, use the flush side of my cutters, make sure that I'm trimming the correct part. I think I will need to cut it just here, so that we're ending up with a spiral inside a spiral, and then I'll try to get that as even as possible on the other side. But if I can't match it, then I will simply move it around a little bit until it sits as neatly as possible. So I think probably just about here is where I'm going to finish on the other side. Pop these two bits away into the scrap pot, and then I'm going to make sure that they're both flat. So what I'm going to do is just draw that one down together so that it sits underneath, and then this one I'm going to squish it, give it a little bit of residual strength. You might need to slightly reform that to make sure that it sits how you imagined you would want it to sit. So the next thing we're going to do is to take some 0.4mm gauge wire, and I'm just going to use a scrap of around about sort of 6 inches or so to begin with, to tie onto the central section of my spiral where we began the design. So I'm just going to wrap that around in the bottom middle of that spiral segment before bringing my loopy part over the top. And what I want to do is to find sensible places to attach. So if that sits dead center in the base of the design, I can see, let's just pull that left wire underneath and out of the way. That's where it'll have to go because it's underneath the spiral. The right hand finer gauge wire just here is over the top. So I'll need to put that over the top of the loopy section down at the base. Let's just hold that all together and show you exactly what I mean. It will slide around because obviously it's naughty. So we've got that into position now. And I'm going to bring the tail of wire all the way around a looped section and up to the top. Now you might need to post that through rather than draw it up all the way through until you can tie those two side sections together. And all we're doing with a wrap like this is literally sewing things together. So I'm going to push that wire up inside the base of that spiral again, draw it all the way through, and I might go for 2 wraps down at the base there. Let's just bring that up slightly so you can see. Push that through the base loop again, And you can either push the leading edge up inside the spiral, or as I did a moment ago, you can draw that up inside the spiral itself. Now I'm just going to wrap a couple of times around the spiral, and these are what I like to call lazy wraps. So we're not filling the entire spiral with wrapping, I'm just doing one lazy diagonal wrap. Then it's going to come up inside the spiral again, and then down inside the next loop of my loopy section. Once I've completed that, I think again, because I did a double wrap on the first section, I'll do a double wrap on the second one, down inside that loop again, tying that neatly together before I go for a lazy wrap just around the spiral. And then I'll probably finish off with a double wrap connecting this last section here. So if I just use my pliers to help, they can be very, very helpful to just take the very tail end of that wire exactly where you want it to go. And that's going to go twice around the spiraled section. The looped section, I beg your pardon. And then I will finish off by wrapping that just around the spiral. Now I can rotate that slightly to make my life easier, or I can gently open out that loopy bit. And I'll finish off with 3 wraps around just the spiral section with that finer gauge wire, before repeating in the opposite direction to bring everything neatly together. If you can only get 2 wraps, that's absolutely fine. I'm working with little scraps of wire that I have available to me. You could work with a little bit more if you wanted to. So the main idea is that we are securely bringing these 2 sections together. Now, because of the way this design is quite springy, if you find that one side creeps up a little bit, you can very simply and sneakily compress it down until they are equal again. So all I would do here is flip over, because I'm right dominant, do exactly the same thing again, follow the same protocol. So I will go for a lazy wrap around that spiraled section down at the base of the bead, before going through the loop on the other side, wherever it is permissible, wherever it seems to fit. And then I will join you back in a moment once I've completed that. If I don't want to bring that over quite so tight, I don't have to. Or I can indeed trim a little bit more off at the top if I want to. And that is what I think I'll do. So I'll show you my process. You can just make this work for you exactly how you want it to. Very, very gently making sure that those wires are nice and tight. So I'm going to connect on at this point. So bring that all the way around the loopy bezel section, I think I'll have to call it. Draw that up nice and tightly through the spiral, around the loopy bezel section, and then up inside the spiral before finishing with 2 wraps on just the spiral section. So if I push that through, that's 1 wrap completed already. And I've decided to go for 2 because that's how many I did on the other side. But what I will need to do is decide which way is forwards. And I think possibly this will be my forward. So I'll push that wire all the way through and trim that away at the back of the design so that it looks equal on both sides. So 2 visible end wraps just here. Let's just pull that straggly bit through and trim. Make sure that end section is down nice and smooth on both sides. So where you can see we've added that swirly section to the main part of the design, which is the spiral and bead. I think probably I need to lose just a little bit more of those spirally sections up at the top. So again, thinking quite carefully about which bit I'm cutting off. Let's just trim that just there. Those can go in the scrap pot for now. And then make sure, if you've got a sticky outy bit, that it goes underneath an existing loop. And the same on the other side. And we will move forwards with all of this in just a moment. So as you can see with this design, a lot of what's going on here is adapting, reducing, adding, moving, fiddling, fudging, just making it sit exactly how I want it to. Before I move on to the next stage, you might find that you need to compress bits of that springy, loopy section, or you might need to stretch them out slightly just to make it sit equally. It's very fluid, it's very mindful, it's lovely to be able to just sit and create those lengths of the swirly whirly bits. You can use them later, keep them stacked up like with your zigzag wire. Let's head back down to the board and get on to the next stage. So now we've got the swirly whirly part added to the spiral part. We're going to use that 5-inch length of 18 gauge I discussed with you earlier. Let's give that a beautiful smooth warm through. Now you can use a round form if you need to get this perfect. I like to just give it a little bit of a run through and then ask it to just bend around until it form fits the base of the design. So I want to create like a U or a smile down at the base to go around the outside of that section. And what we're going to do is start by using an 18-inch length of 0.4 or 26 gauge, and we're going to add that outer strength. As I mentioned earlier, you can use the heavier wire if you want to. I'm just going to use some 1mm. I'm going to thread approximately half of my fine wire through there, through the centre lowest part. Doesn't matter if it's a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, dependent on how it's fallen. We're just going to do half at a time just to make life that little bit easier. So I'm going to do a lazy wrap now around just that frame, the outer frame. So just push that around gently. The reason I call it a lazy wrap is it looks a little bit like a helter-skelter or a helix, just running around the outside of that frame. Now, if you don't like it that long, you can go for 2 lazy wraps between each connection point. So my next connection point will be this outside part of the loopy bezel part. I'm going to push the end of my finer gauge wire down through the centre, tying the outside frame to the loopy section. So now I'm going to do 2 lazy wraps around just the outer frame and then push the end of the wire down through the next loop, pull that into position. Now because these two are really close together, I'm just going to do 1 lazy wrap around the outside frame. Then I'm going to push the wire down just inside the outside of these 2 loops on that lovely loopy bezel. Push that all the way through. I've got space now for 2 lazy wraps around that outside frame. So that's 1, that's 2, just around the outside frame. Making sure that they're evenly spaced where possible. And then we're going to push the end down through the next available loop, like so. I think there's only space for 1 lazy wrap now. And then down just inside the outer of those 2 looped sections. And I've got space for 2 lazy wraps. That's 1. Be very gentle when you're pulling against this. Pull that bead back down into position if it's getting out of whack. And you can also take a second to ensure that your spirally bit at the very end of your loop section sits exactly how you want it to. Push the tail down inside that last looped section. And then I'm going to finish with a couple of wraps really, really tight against that last connection point. So that's 1 and 2 and 3. So why don't we turn that over the top, trim the end away, make sure you trim the right bit of wire, push the tail all the way down. So that's 1/2 of your outer frame attached to your spiral filigree, or Fauxligree if you prefer. I love that. There will be people that hate it, I'm sure. When you're ready to continue on the opposite side, you can flip the whole thing over and you'll need to just carry on in exactly the same way. So you can see that I would need to put some tension into that very, very lowest section where we have a connection point. Then we will go for 2 lazy wraps before connecting to the outside loop on this next section, making sure there's tension but not so much that you would be deforming that outside frame. Single lazy wrap because it's a small gap, and then push down inside the loop, and so on all the way up to the top until you finish with 3 wraps just on that outside frame. So it can take a little while to get that to sit exactly how you want it to. Now we've got some wires crossing over at the top, which is good. We need a little bit of excess wire just there. We're going to turn them into some simple loops just to finish off the effect of this swirly whirly section. And it will also give us an opportunity to tie everything together super strong. So let's head back down to the board for the last section of today's tutorial. So what we're going to do now is to create small loops utilising the end sections of wire on both sides. What I tend to do is to position my round nose pliers where I think that loop will need to be and draw the wire all the way around. In that way you can kind of move it along if you need to. So let's flatten that down to begin with. I will need to bring that a little bit closer to the end of my swirly whirly section. So I'm going to pop those pliers back in and then just rotate until it sits how I want it to, which is touching both the centre post, that core wire where the bead sits, and also the top of the swirly whirly section. Ideally, I think I'd want that just a little bit larger, so I'm going to open that back up and then just play with that until it sits how I want it to. You can move that wire around to your heart's content because we warmed it so nicely to begin with. Once you're happy with how that's sitting, we're going to trim that away at the point where it crosses over itself, making sure you cut just the right wire, not your finger or anything else. So let's go again, but on the other side. This time I'm going to bring it round underneath. So I position the tine or the side of my plier just so, draw that wire all the way around. I can play with that again until it sits exactly where I want it to. So the joy of working with wire is, generally speaking, if you're kind to it, it will be kind to you and give you an opportunity to just sit that exactly how you desire. So let's trim that at the crossover point. And then of course you can switch out to your favourite flat facing pliers, just to make sure that those spirals or those little loops just on the end are equal to each other and they sit how and where you want them to. So do take your time. The more time you spend on it now, the better, more pleased you will be with your end product. So we are going to be using some more 0.4mm gauge wire. And I think probably around about 12 inches will be sufficient. This is equivalent to 26 gauge. So at this stage you will see that my spiraled bead section is away at the back, and that's fine. That's exactly where I want it to be. I'm going to begin by just allowing a little section of that wire over the end and getting a good starting point. So I've wrapped about 6 or 7 times, and what I will then do is just push that last ½ inch or so of wire around until we have a really lovely spring-like tightly formed spiral of wire over the top of that core, making sure it's nice and neat and tied up tightly, compressed, and then I'm just going to push that down. Now I'm going to look carefully to see which I think is the front of my design. I think probably this is the front, which is grand. So what we're going to do is to start tying that central core together with either side of the faux filigree. So I can see access points up inside this first loop. So I'm going to draw that wire around the back of the core and up inside the rightmost loop, pushing that coil of wire up to the centre between those two loops as we're looking at them, so that when I draw the wire over the top and down through the loop on the other side, pull that through neatly, what you'll see is one complete bar going over the surface. So if you start on the wrong side, what will happen is you'll have half a bar of that wire. We actually are going to look for 2 bars of wire, so I'm bringing that tail of wire up inside the right hand loop again. Little bit of tension, but not so much that anything crosses over. We want the loops either side of that central bead core wire. So push the wire again down it through the left hand loop, and as you bring that wire tautly down into position, just control it so that you get 2 bars of wire together. Then we're going to put some inside, going just around the core wire this time. So over the top of the bead, push that down into position with your nails and make sure that you've got a nice flat aspect to all of that wrapping. You can compress the springs, utilising the end of your plier tips. Now we're up at those 2 loops from the outside frame wire. So again, I'm coming up inside the right hand loop from the rear of that core wire, and then down through the left hand loop so that you get a complete bar of wire. Pull that nice and tight so that the bar appears across from the right loop over the central core inside the left loop. And again, we will go for another wrap in the same orientation. So making sure that there is tension, but not so much that you bring any of that wire over the top of each other. Down inside the left hand loop. Just control that so that those 2 bars of wire sit side by side. Push them firmly into position, and then finish with as many wraps as you fancy on that core wire. I would say at least 3 for security, but you could balance out with the same number you did at the beginning point. It really does depend on how big a bail you want. So I'm just going to, I think, go for 1 more and then trim the excess away. Little bits of fine gauge wire like this, 0.426 gauge, are really useful for tying stuff together temporarily whilst you're working. So don't throw it away, just keep hold of it, and you can use it as a scrap. Compress everything together and give that a very gentle squish. All that remains is a wrapped loop. So I'm going to allow a tiny gap above my little coil on that core, like so. I'm then going to just put some heat into the top where we started. And if you remember, we just bent this over so that we could control the bead from falling off. So if you warm it nicely, you should be able to undo it and use it. So let's just open that out. We may find that we need that last little bit of wire made available to us. So let's go for a 6mm bail up at the top. Draw that wire all the way around. Centralise that bail. And then we're going to finish off by wrapping in that small gap that we left. So I think at least 2 wraps, and then take that round to the back. We can trim that last little bit away. Before we grip hold of the bail and then squish that sticky uppy tail very, very neatly and tightly down onto the core wire. And there you have your faux filigree pendant. 2 slightly different sizes, 2 slightly different looks, but the technique is endlessly customizable. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you can make these super chunky like these are, or you can size it down, use slightly lighter wires, slightly smaller beads, have lots of fun with the Fauxligree pendant. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the GemHawks YouTube channel. Every time you like a video, leave a positive comment, request a new tutorial, or share one of my videos, the channel gets more coverage. Don't forget that by pressing the subscription bell, you do get notifications, but as I only upload once a week, hopefully that shouldn't be too annoying. I look forward to seeing you again very soon. My name is GemHawks. Bye for now.